If you make it increasingly difficult for a new business to compete because so much of the landscape now is sort of dominated by just a few players that are owning all of these different types of assets, then I think that really puts us in a position as a country where we're going to struggle to generate, good growth in the future.
Big companies are a fact of life in Canada. Banks, airlines, telecom. But what happens when big becomes too big? Hi, I'm Paul Haberstrood. Welcome to The Cost of Living. Rogers, Bell and Telus are so big they have their own nickname, Robellus. Cineplex rakes in 3/4 of the Canadian box office. Big companies suck up a lot of oxygen in this country. And money. So where does that leave the little guy? Also today, in a high school movie, there's always a scene of the unpopular kid eating alone in the cafeteria. Well now, that kid eating alone is cool. The script has been flipped. And restaurants are setting more tables for one. Up first, you know how people invent stuff? Then an industry grows up around that. It comes with jobs, paychecks, all that good stuff. Other countries are doing more of that than Canada. And we're starting to feel it. When we compare Canada to the US, and let's face it, we do, we like to think we punch above our weight. Yeah, they have 10 times our population, but hey, we've got universal healthcare. And, we're really nice.
We are really nice. And we make butter tarts here.
Great point. Great point, Jen Keane.
But you know where we don't come off quite as well, Paul? Our standard of living.
Well, you just made this a whole bunch less fun now, didn't you?
I know. Sorry about that. But it is a big, important thing, and Canada is falling behind.
And how are we measuring this?
We can look at per capita GDP. So just to get wonky for a second, you've got GDP, the gross domestic product, the monetary value of a country's economic activity in a year. You divide that among the entire population, and per capita GDP is your slice of that pie. Now, in Canada, our slice is getting smaller. In the United States, their slice is getting bigger.
So where's the gap now? Because the U.S., they have traditionally been ahead of us on this measure.
Yeah, we've always been a little bit behind. But right now, per capita GDP in the U.S., it stands at around $66,000. And in Canada, it's just over $44,000.
So $22,000. I mean, that is bigger than it has been, yeah, but we're also talking about per capita GDP, which is kind of a weird measure to get your mind around. So what does $22,000 actually look like in our life?
Well, in the simplest terms, it means this.
If you make American dollars and you spend in American dollars, the cost of living is cheaper than if you are spending in Canadian dollars and you make Canadian dollars.
Evie Leviton has seen this firsthand because 3 years ago, she cashed in on Toronto's hot housing market and moved with her entire family from Toronto to Florida.
A few people were moving to Florida, and I always said to my husband, if we're going to ever move somewhere, there better be a beach nearby.
So I'm betting she got her beach.
She did. She's 25 minutes from the water in Boca Raton.
And she bought in Florida, and I'm also betting that housing in Florida way cheaper than housing in Toronto.
Well, yeah. I mean, the average house price in Ontario is around $850,000 Canadian. In Florida, that's more like $500,000. So that's one of the reasons that our standard of living is lower. We have to pour way more of our earnings into housing. And that's not the only thing that's cheaper in the United States.
Things like home maintenance, landscaping, much cheaper here. Gas, much cheaper. That's another one of the important things, gas and groceries. That's a huge one because when we came to Canada in the summer and I saw the price of gas, I was like, what?
Okay, so gas, groceries, yeah, those things are cheaper there, but the U.S. is also 10 times our size. That is going to come with some advantages. But, historically, you look at Canada, we've been okay.
Yeah, but what is starting to worry some people is how big the difference between our economies is getting. The Canadian economist Trevor Tombe wrote about this recently in the online newsletter The Hub. He says the last time the gap was this big for this long, Sir John A. Macdonald was Prime Minister.
So this is kind of historic, like a historic gap. Why is it opening up like this now?
Because their economy is growing faster than ours is. Like, our economy is growing, but just a little bit, and our population has been growing quite a lot. So per person, we're falling behind. And this is a big issue for Joel Blitt. He's an economist at the University of Waterloo.
Yeah, it is actually probably the thing that keeps me up at night, because it means that our kids are going to have a lower standard of living than kids in our peer countries, unless we manage to somehow change the trajectory.
Obviously, we want our kids to be better off than us, but you look at this issue of GDP per capita, I mean, this is a hard problem. Everyone has their own take on what the root cause of it is. What does Joel think?
He thinks it's all about productivity. Canada isn't investing enough in research and development, in new tech, in new, better ways of doing things.
You know, we're not innovating. We're not coming up with better products that generate more value, right? So that Canadians producing this, if you're producing a better product that people want more, that sells for higher prices, then we're able to generate more in an hour of work. We're also not investing in equipment and machinery and technology. And therefore, Canadians don't have all of these tools at their disposal so that they can be more productive and produce more in an hour of work. So as a result, the average Canadian is producing way less than the average American.
Now, Canada has tried to solve this problem for a long time. We've thrown a lot of stuff in the wall. Not a lot of it has stuck.
Yeah, and depending on who you talk to, you might get a different answer to the problem. Ottawa says companies need to spend some of that capital they're sitting on and invest more in workers. And businesses say governments need to speed up approvals and cut red tape. Whatever the reason, Joel says, if we don't do something, it's going to get real.
So many of the things that our social services in general, our public social safety net, all of these things require significant investments. And if as a country we're just not producing enough, you can't afford to have them at the level that we as Canadians are accustomed to and that we identify with.
So we're okay now, but you look around at some other countries, they used to be okay too, right until they weren't. And we don't want to be one of those countries.
No, and I mean, it seems like something that can't happen to us, right? We've been a very prosperous country for a long time. But just for some context, like Joel comes from South America. He has seen economies go sideways.
Canadians can't imagine that we could go down that road of Argentina. But the fact is that we can. And unless we do something, I'm actually afraid that we are going to. Part of the reason why we have this complacency is I think we don't understand how quickly things can turn and how we can actually reach a tipping point. You know, as we get poorer relative to other countries, all of a sudden there are these feedback loops that can actually make this become worse and worse really, really quickly.
So he's painting a pretty dire potential future here. When he talks about feedback loops, what's he talking about there?
The stronger the U.S. gets relative to us, the more capital is going to flow south. And that can happen with people as well. If the opportunities aren't here, the best and the brightest might not want to come here or will lose them. In 2022, nearly 125,000 people emigrated from Canada to the United States. And that was a 70% increase over a decade earlier.
So that's way up.
Yeah. And look at someone like Evie Leviton. She owns a small business. It's called The Balanced Company. She sells subscription boxes for organic snacks and that kind of thing. She has big ambitions, and they took her across the border.
And how are things working out?
It is taking a while for her to get to where she wants to be. It's definitely more competitive in the United States, but she has no regrets.
Best decision of our life. It was the best decision of our life. It showed me what I'm capable of as an entrepreneur. I can see that my children are thriving. As much as I love home in Toronto, I hate winter with all my being. And I'm okay never seeing snow ever again in my entire life.
She really doesn't like snow.
No.
But Jen, we're also painting a pretty bleak picture here for Canada. We know the economy ebbs, it flows. Yeah, we might be ebbing now, but we can turn things around, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, just because the line is headed in one direction doesn't mean it will always go in that direction. And Joel thinks that we can turn it around. The good thing is that it's kind of part of the national conversation in a way that it hasn't been in a while. You talked about this recently. The Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada has said that there's a productivity emergency out there. So things can be done. We'll see if it happens.
Thanks, Jen.
You're welcome.
On your Radio and by podcast, this is The Cost of Living. I'm Paul Haberstrood. Walking into a restaurant and saying, "Table for one?" isn't for everyone. Oh, how sad. You couldn't scrape up a single dinner companion? At least that's how it used to be. These days, we know being alone isn't the same as being lonely. And restaurants know something else. Solo diners still pay the bill.
A couple of years ago, Kyle Prescott was traveling a lot for work. He was sick of eating fast food. So he took the plunge and went out to a nice restaurant by himself.
Like anything you do for the first time, it was a little scary to say, am I being judged, or they're going to ask me questions?
But he got over it. And these days, he goes out to eat alone at least once a week.
Hi, table for one under Kyle? Sure, you can follow me. Thank you.
Lunches, dinners. He even booked a table for one at a Michelin-starred restaurant.
I think I ended up doing 6 dishes. Yep, made sure I was hungry. 6 dishes for myself. So there is a bit of that, treat yourself.
In the past 6 months, more than 40% of Canadians say they've dined alone in a restaurant. At the same time, reservations for one have also gone up.
I'm not surprised. I think
Bruce McAdams teaches at the School of Hospitality, Food and Tourism at the University of Guelph. He says younger generations are all about me time.
so that might mean, you know what, I'm alone tonight instead of sitting down and having a frozen dinner in front of the TV. I'm going to treat myself and go out and go to a nice restaurant.
More Canadians are living alone than ever before. And Bruce says people are more comfortable being alone. And restaurants, they're paying attention. Some are welcoming single diners with a glass of bubbly. Others are offering them a front row seat to watch the chef in action. The days when you'd be seated in the back next to the swinging door are over.
The willingness for chefs, for owners and servers to say, we'll accommodate you, and if you want a single size of this, we can do this for you. We're just really glad you're with us tonight.
Bruce says times are tough for restaurants right now. Revenues are still 10% lower than they were 5 years ago. And according to Open Table, people who eat alone spend 43% more than the average diner.
So right now, I think people are willing to cater to single diners more. They're looking at it as a new and emerging market, or a market that maybe they haven't tried to capitalize on before.
But not everyone thinks the trend is all good news.
I think it could be a good news story or a bad news story, depending on what the reason is. And it's probably a little bit of both.
Cindy Chan is a marketing professor at the University of Toronto who specializes in consumer psychology. She says there's a loneliness epidemic out there. Solo dining could be a reflection of that.
If it's a signal that people have fewer social connections and are resorting to having to dine alone unwillingly, then that's not great, right?
But on the other hand,
anytime you can get people out of their homes, and even if you're not dining with others, you are interacting with others, you're in a social environment, you are engaging in an activity that can offer enjoyment and pleasure.
Kyle Prescott is all in on dining alone. He likes to sit up close to the kitchen, chat up the chef, take pictures of his food, and order as much as he wants.
I feel like a few folks think I'm just a reviewer. So I get a couple things get sent my way that's like, oh, yeah, thanks. Who else is just coming into the restaurant and asking for everything they can on the menu?
For the Cost of Living, I'm Ellis Cho.
This is The Cost of Living. I'm Paul Haberstrood. What's your favorite opoly? Monopoly is the classic. But in Canada, we have them all. The duopoly, Air Canada and WestJet. All kinds of oligopolies. Rogers, Bell, and Telus dominate telecom. We have the big five banks. Loblaw, Metro, and Sobeys sell us nearly 2/3 of our groceries. Try to avoid these companies when you're just going about your day-to-day life. It's tough. Vas Bednar and Denise Hearn argue that's a problem. They're the authors of a new book, The Big Fix: How Companies Capture Markets and Harm Canadians. So Vas, Denise, one of the things you talk about in the book is the illusion of choice. What is that?
So the illusion of choice is that, there's two main ways that this happens, where we think that we're choosing one company over another, and that companies are actually competing for our dollars. But when you go to the grocery store and you look at the shelf, there's all sorts of, as an example, private label products that are owned by the grocery stores. And we know, of course, No Name and Joe Fresh, but there are a proliferation of others. Even when you buy on Amazon now, many of the Amazon products that are featured are owned by Amazon, and it's not disclosed. And so, another example we use is if you go into any sunglasses hut in the mall, you see Gucci, you see Ray-Ban, you see Oakley, and you think, oh, I'm going to choose one of these brands over the other and support a different company. But they're actually all owned by one company, EssilorLuxottica, who also owns Sunglass Hut and all the retail outlets. So this illusion of competition where companies maintain a whole brand of, a portfolio of brands makes it seem like there's a lot more competition than there really is in markets. And it can be, let's say it can, have economies of scale. Maybe it makes things more efficient. But really, oftentimes what it's used to do is just to jack up prices. And that's why you see sunglasses and prescription lenses, being really expensive. And sometimes they can have up to 1,000% markup, which is, it may cost them, a few dollars to manufacture a product, but then they're selling it for hundreds or, even more than that.
What happened before the glasses industry consolidated? Like when Ray-Ban was just Ray-Ban, Oakley was just Oakley. Were those markups less because those companies were out there, they were competing, and presumably they were competing on price?
So we're not doing the nuts and bolts numeric, this is what a pair of glasses cost in that time period. What we really want to bring forward is that element of the illusion, right? Pulling people away from just these conversations that are very, I'll say, concentrated, in airline, in banking, in groceries and telecom, and sort of say, where and how is consolidation occurring outside of these markets, but also how have these markets fundamentally changed, right? Many grocery stores are not just grocery stores anymore, and the same is true in telecommunications.
Well, in the book, you talk about what you call everything companies. What's an everything company?
An everything company is a company that has moved from just wanting to dominate one industry to collecting assets across industries. And I think sometimes when you get to that sort of equilibrium in markets where, they're really not that interested in stealing market share from one another because there's a little bit of a kind of cozy oligopoly going and, they've got a good gig. And so how are they going to generate growth? And that's where you see they start to leverage their dominance in one industry to add on and sort of start to play in other industries. So for an example, TELUS, if we take TELUS, is operational in healthcare. They are the number 2 pharmacy benefit manager, which is a middleman that sits between pharmacies and the drug insurers and sort of negotiates prices. They also are active in agriculture. And so they really have diversified. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we want to say that complicates conversations when we say, oh, we just need a foreign competitor here to compete with TELUS on their telco business. Well, actually, TELUS isn't just a telecom company anymore. It has all of these reinforcing assets across industries. And so how could you actually generate a competitor to that kind of everything company?
Okay, but if TELUS wants to be a conglomerate and it thinks it can make money that way, isn't that fine? Like, isn't that just TELUS's choice?
Yeah, there are some benefits maybe to that in the sense that, okay, they're a big company. They're some might argue operationally successful. They know how to run, a big, large business. I think when we look at companies like Amazon, which is the quintessential everything company, you start to really understand this sort of flywheel mentality that they want to be anywhere that customers are spending money, basically from waking to sleeping. They want to be, as you say, okay, maybe now they're going to be controlling your cell phone bill. They're going to be controlling where you go to eat. And it raises the question of how many new entrants, how many new startups do we want to be able to have a chance to compete in Canada? And we are really, low on those numbers. Startups are stagnating. We don't have a lot of new entrants. And that's where productivity growth comes from. That's where jobs come from, is new businesses. And if you make it increasingly difficult for a new business to compete, because so much of the landscape now is sort of dominated by just a few players that are owning all of these different types of assets, then I think that really puts us in a position as a country where we're going to struggle to generate, good growth in the future.
Okay, but what about the argument that size matters? Especially if you're a Canadian company, you want to compete internationally. This is what you always hear. You need to be big, otherwise you're going to get taken out. If we put curbs on our national champions, where does that leave us in regards to competing globally?
Again, it's not about the curbs of growth or being anti-growth or anti-innovation, right? We're pro-innovation for firms, but also pro-policy innovation, right? That is, having the right structures, the right regulatory environments in place outside of what has historically been Canada's approach, as you said, picking winners, right? National champions. Probably for too long, geography has been our destiny in Canada. And we've sort of accepted that maybe because of the size of our country, maybe because of the way our population is dispersed, we need to accept or make trade-offs and facilitate bigness in a way that other countries might not. But I think with the digital economy, we've seen that argument sort of thrown on its head, right? Where now we're in the same kind of globalized context where you could say we have international winners that are dominating our everyday lives, that are influencing business in negative ways. And why is that? Because of either the under-enforcement of our laws or the lack of them completely, right? And Amazon, I think, is that kind of example. You could say Amazon is the global champion for e-commerce, and it has set the rules for e-commerce in Amazon's favor.
Yeah, so I'll just add to that I think when we talk about national champions, we fail to distinguish between what Vas is talking about, which are highly globalized markets, sometimes digital markets, and highly localized markets where these are not globally tradable goods. We're not exporting, internationally, things like going to the vet. Private equity is rolling up bowling alleys and bakeries and all kinds of things that, these are not globally tradable things where you need a national champion. And so I think, yes, this is definitely an important debate, and we want Canada to be internationally competitive. We want it, I want it to be a little bit protectionist in some ways against, larger American firms or European firms sort of dominating every landscape. But I think, when we talk about national champions, we need to make the distinction. What types of industries are we talking about? Are these actually globally, traded supply chains, or are these highly localized markets like grocery where, you don't necessarily need to have a national champion because you're not directly competing with a Trader Joe's, as an example.
So if we agree that, yes, a lack of competition is bad for this country, what are the biggest consequences of this that you see?
I mean, there are so many in terms of depressed wages, escalating price, a decrease in innovation that we've pointed to, a decrease in kind of the quality of products and services that we receive. But I think one of the biggest prices we're paying today in Canada, sort of societally, is that product of public anger. So people are very frustrated, right? And Tim Wu said this. He's a Canadian, but he was previously at the FTC. He said this last year at Canada's Competition Summit. He sort of made this point around how you have to pay attention directionally to public anger. It may not be the source of policy solutions. I'm thinking of elements like the Loblaw boycott that started earlier this year, but that the work of policymakers is to be a broker of that and to sort of channel that into productive solutions. And I think people are very frustrated, both in terms of feeling disappointed or that that trust relationship between corporations and citizens has really eroded, but also a loss of trust in the state, right? Denise and I are pointing to the power and possibility of better or more comprehensive public policy to reshape and kind of break open these markets. But if you feel that the government has failed you because of how you're experiencing corporate concentration, it might be hard to kind of come around to that being the solution.
Well, Vas Bednar, Denise Hearn, it's a big conversation. I'm sure we'll talk again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vas Bednar and Denise Hearn are the authors of a new book, The Big Fix: How Companies Capture Markets and Harm Canadians. Coming up on next week's show, what happens when your pet outlives you?
You know, I'm in the will for this lady with 30 birds, and then I have another friend who has like 6 or 8 birds, and then I've got another friend who has another 6 or 8, and it's like, man, if you guys all die at once, like $10,000 isn't going to be enough for anybody to do this job, right?
Hey, your cat may have 9 lives, but you don't. So who will pay for sprinkles when you're gone? Pet inheritances. That's next week. The Cost of Living is based in Calgary. The show is produced by Danielle Nerman, Ellis Cho, and Jennifer Keane, with help from Caroline, it's just resting, Ferris. I'm Paul Habersrud. Thanks for listening.